dangerous places with dangerous people. I had to read people, know how to make them feel comfortable with me quickly, and basically not get killed or robbed.
Okay.
So I kind of got good at like talking with people, right? Like I'd meet
Today, I
people.
am sitting down with Brian Jenny, who is someone who I've known for a very long time. I'd love to start off by talking about your background. You said that you were basically living in a bad rap video. You were involved in crime. You didn't really have too much direction. Can you talk more
Yeah.
about how you got started? Like what was your life looking like before you became a developer?
Yeah, it's so wild when I think about my past, and I often do, honestly. So I was always a bit of a hustler as a kid, right? Like I like to do car washes, and I was always intrigued with the idea of making money. And unfortunately, that led me down a path where I thought, how can I make more money, right?
Hmm.
Easily. And so I was already on a path, not so great path. I was lost in addiction, drinking, doing other stuff, drugs, if I'm being honest. And I saw a friend making a ton of money doing illegal things, and I thought I could do that. And I got into that lifestyle and I got decent at it actually. And I saw all this fast money coming in, which just fueled my addiction even more. And I wasn't like some criminal gangster guy either. I kind of had to fake it basically. I was always intrigued with the money aspect of the like whole drug culture and things like that. And so I just got consumed in it. And it was just taking my life in this very negative place. And an intervention basically happened, which
Hmm.
helped me turn my life around, which we can get into all that too. But that was kind of how my life was in the past. I was like a completely different Brian.
Where were you living at the time?
I was in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm from Oakland originally, and growing up in Oakland, if you're not familiar with it, you get exposed to crime. Honestly, yeah, I was exposed to a lot of opportunities for
Hmm.
crime at a young age, so it wasn't a completely foreign thing to me either. And I moved to Richmond, California as well. But yeah, all this time doing these things was spent in the Bay Area.
And I'm really curious about your psychology or thought process as you were getting into this stuff. How did you think about long term? Like, okay, 5 or 10 years from now, did you also think, okay, I'm also going to go to high school or college at the same time and have like a longer term stable career?
I had such short term thinking back then. I was just thinking, how can I make it to the next day? That's also the problem with that addict mind state is that you're just looking like, how can I make enough money to get to the next day, the next party,
Hmm.
the next thing I want to do? And I had no long term plan. Also, I was so naive at this stage. And I was not particularly young either. I was in my mid 20s. I had a kid. I don't
Hmm.
know what I was thinking, if I'm being completely honest with you. That was the problem with this like monkey on my back, basically telling me like, whatever you do, just make more money to keep this party going, essentially. And I thought eventually I'll figure it out. This kind of lottery mentality where you think eventually I'll get older and I'll just figure it out and things will just kind of fall into place. It was fantasy type of
Hmm.
thinking.
What was the intervention that you mentioned?
It was it was pretty bad night. So it was Easter Sunday. I'll never forget this. And I'd gone out with a buddy, went drinking till like 6 a.m., crashed a car, came back, left the car in the street basically, walked back home, still drinking, like at 6 a.m. Walked into my house. Kids are there, ready for Easter. I'm completely out of it. And I just go into the bedroom. And then I get a knock at the door. It's my mom. And I'm thinking, what are you doing here? She's like, Ryan, I want to talk to you. She takes me outside, hands me a letter, and reads this gut wrenching letter to me, basically telling me she's not happy with me, not proud of me, and how she thinks my family should leave me, and how her and my girlfriend at the time, who's now I'm still with, my partner of now 13 years, and she
Hmm.
says she's gonna leave you, and I think she should. I told her she should because you're not fit to be a parent, and I just broke down, and I was mad. Was angry at them, kind of your typical selfish kind of addict mind state where you're thinking, no, what about me? What about me? And then I said, I'll stop. I didn't know how. I didn't know what I was going to do. I just wanted them to be quiet, honestly. I was like, I just want this to stop. And I'll say whatever I got to say to get you off my back. And I had no clue how I was going to do this. But then something happened where I thought I can go for a day, right? It's not a big deal. And then I kind of told some friends of mine, said, oh, how long are you really going to do this for? And I thought, does nobody think I can do this? And then I thought, I'm just going to keep going one day. And I just like one day. And I'm like, I'm just not going to do it again tomorrow. And then people say, oh, how long are you going to go? I'm like, I don't know. And now, like, what, 11, 12 years later, just kept going.
I mean, what an act of generosity effectively your mom gave you. Like the fact that she cared that much to show up in
Saved my
the,
life.
yeah, like at 6 a.m. in the morning and kind of
Hmm.
pull you out of that state of, it sounds like you didn't really have a long-term plan or long-term thinking, and she kind of pulled you out of that. And that's
Yeah.
such a amazing gift that your mom gave you.
Yeah, it was amazing. I thank her a lot even now because I think how much my life has significantly changed from taking that one massive blocker out of my way and then freeing me up to do things that I should have been because I had strayed so far from who I was as a person that I don't even recognize. When I look at pictures of myself then or even think about what I think, it's like two different people. It's almost like looking at a stranger, which is why I
Hmm.
feel more comfortable talking about it now. Because for a while I did not. I honestly did wait a very long time because I'm like, I want to prove myself in tech and I don't want people to judge me or think these crazy things about me. So I just didn't want to bring it up. And now I look at it and like, yeah, that was a foreign version, a past that just seems like a movie now.
And I'm curious if there are people who are watching who are struggling with something similar. Can you talk a bit more about how were you able to abstain? You said one day at a time, just
Yeah.
don't drink, don't do drugs. Was there anything else involved there, like changing the people you hang out with, like change your mindset? What exactly happened to allow you to abstain
Hmm.
for that whole period?
Very practically, I tell this to a lot of people, whether they're friends, acquaintances that also want to stop doing whatever, is you have to find something to replace that addiction. And for me, at first it was candy, which is actually pretty common for people that have like an alcohol abuse problem, that's sugar that you need. And so I found myself eating a lot of candy. Not a great habit, bad habit, but it was something to kind of give me that rush I needed.
Hmm.
Then exercise, which was the big unlock, huge unlock there, because those endorphins that I felt created that feedback loop. Like, okay, I do this thing, it's positive. Then I get that rush of endorphins, which I like. My body wants it. And then that kind of snowballed into just more and more working out. And I realized I still have this addictive personality, maybe. I think we all do. But
Hmm.
I tend to really overdo things, which I'm trying to get better at. But that was ultimately how I replaced one addiction with another. Also, things like figuring out what my triggers were. Like, I'm like, well, Thursday nights, I really like to drink, or Saturday nights, I really like to drink. What am I going to do? I start going to movies by myself, and that would take up 3 hours of time. And by then I'm like, okay, well, now that time is over. I sat in a theater and I watched a movie, and here I am. So I watched a ton of movies, ate a lot of candy, eventually started exercising. And the not so fun part to talk about is that I just lost a lot of friends. I didn't have as many friends as I thought. It was much lonelier than I would have imagined. I had a ton of friends before this. I mean, I just would go everywhere. Everybody knew me. I was kind of well known within this section of the city. And then eventually people just didn't hang out anymore. And I realized I couldn't really hang out with him because all we had in common was drinking or doing bad stuff. So I had to find a way to make new friends at an older age, which is not always easy. And I did that mostly by going to the gym, meeting people at the gym, doing other activities, coding, of course, and getting
Yeah.
exposed to a lot of people in that community.
Let's talk about that. So,
Hmm.
I think one of the things I'm hearing is that as you were going through this huge transition in your life, you went from living in the moment almost to a fault and just being very focused on today to now thinking ahead of, hey, I might start drinking on a Saturday night. So let me plan ahead for that and create a system around me where I protect myself from that. And so I'm curious about now in terms of the career stuff, right? Like getting into the development and engineering
Hmm.
part of it. How did you now think about what you were going to do with your career after, having this kind of epiphany that, okay, I need to fix my life?
Yeah. Once I fixed, quote unquote, my life, I saw, okay, there's a future. I have children. I see that I'm not going to die, because that was a real fear of mine. Actually, I had made some enemies and I had
Hmm.
people threatening my life. And I was thinking, maybe I'm not going to even make it that far anyway. So I thought, whatever, right? Like if I'm not going to make it, then maybe I'll just kind of go out with a bang type of idea. Then I saw a
Oh,
future. I'm like, well, I do have a future and I do want my kids to have a better life. And I don't want my kids to go down this path because I see how much trouble it caused me. It took most of my life, if I think about it, between like 16 or 14 and like 30, that's all I did. And I'm like, I don't want my kids doing this. Like, what can I do? And that led me to think, what do I want as a career too? Because I'm like, I don't want to just get by. I still have that hustler mentality too. And I think that led me to think, I know I can do more, but I need to find a legal avenue to do these things. And I started riding around the Bay Area. I was doing rideshare at the time, meeting people. And that's when coding kind of entered my brain as a potential to do. And when I found out what it was and that I liked it, I'm like, oh, this is amazing. And then I found out the money that was available doing it. That was like icing on the cake. Because honestly, I had zero clue about the earning potential of software engineers at the time. I just thought if you can get paid at all to do this and I can maybe do some freelance stuff, hey, great. I'll just do like a job and, maybe do some freelance on the side, and that'll be my hustle. And then I didn't realize in the Bay Area, oh, you can make more than a doctor out here doing this as well. And that really piqued my interest.
What's so interesting is that people don't think of, I'm going to drive for Lyft or Uber as networking, but you
Yeah,
turned it
right.
into that, right? Like you were able
Yeah.
to interact and you were curious enough. That's the key unlock. You were curious enough, I imagine, in asking them questions and engaging with them that you learned about this whole new world that really did change your life. And now it's what you're doing full time every day and you're making a great living off of it, right? So I think that's a huge lesson that don't just view your job as a job. Like if you want it to be something bigger, you can use it as
Yeah.
something bigger.
For sure. And a lot of that was translated from my old life. Like I would be meeting people, strangers all the time, doing high stakes transactions, like in parking lots, housing projects, dangerous places with dangerous people. I had to read people, know how to make them feel comfortable with me quickly, and basically not get killed or robbed. So I kind of got good at like talking with people, right? Like I'd meet people and I'd want to like get to know them. And I was just genuinely curious about people's lives. So driving people around the Bay Area, I'm like, oh, so what do you do? Typical conversation starter. And they say, I work as a software. And to me, I'm like, I didn't know what that meant. I'm like, oh, cool. So what does that mean? Like, what do you do? I met a guy that worked at Slack one time. And now that would really impress me. Back then, I'm like, I don't know what that is. And he ended up like writing me an email and giving me this detailed list of what to study. And I thought, what a nice guy. And I thought,
Wow.
never heard of that company.
So let's talk about that. So you now have the spark of awareness of, hey, there's this whole industry in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, software engineering. It sounds like you don't have too many connections. You didn't study computer science. How do you now go from driving Lyft and Uber into actually learning the skills needed to become a software engineer?
Yeah. So there was a bit of a transition period between crime and the first software job, which is about a year and a half I spent at a community college through a friend. He basically just hooked me up with this job, which was essentially like an admin assistant job. Part of the job was doing these really basic updates to this website through a content management system, kind of like WordPress. And there was a webmaster at the school, and I'd expressed some interest already in coding. I was on Codecademy while at work. Like during my lunch break, I'd go on Codecademy. I'm like, okay, I'm going to learn this stuff. Like, what do you learn? Like the person in Lyft said, oh, you should learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript, basic stuff. And I thought, cool. And I was like really enjoying it. And then I had to do an update to the website. She ended up showing me how to like write code in an editor and like inspect the code on a site using like the Chrome Dev Tools. And that just blew my mind. I'm like, whoa, this is nuts. And she's the one that really like kind of catapulted me from like, okay, Codecademy is a great tool to learn these basics, but how do I get stuff like on a web page? And that led me down an interesting rabbit hole where I started going to meetups in the Bay Area and meeting other software engineers and just filling in those gaps. I'm like, okay, I don't get this. Like something as simple as a code editor. Like how, like where do you write the code and what happens to it after I save this file? Like what do I do with it next? So it's like, oh yeah, you can open it up on your like, oh, what if I wanted other people to see it? And somebody say, oh, well, you could like FTP it and then like buy a domain. And then like, okay, already super complicated. But they just kept giving me these little nuggets of what to do next. And eventually I'm like, this is too hard for me to figure out all on my own. And I ended up going to a boot camp in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it was like a front end boot camp. And that was really what filled in all these other gaps. By this point, I was doing very basic sites. I had done some freelance work and I didn't know any JavaScript. And that's the thing I really wanted to learn, which they helped me to get.
So the community college, was that just general education or did you go in with the intention of wanting to do coding and software engineering?
No, I was there for work. I was just there working in an office.
Oh, okay. So you weren't taking classes at the community college.
No.
You were working there as an admin assistant. And then through
Yeah.
that, you learned about this boot camp, which you then later enrolled into.
Exactly. Yeah. And I was like doing basic website updates for the school, like these really
Gotcha.
And I thought, oh, this is really fun. And that kind of led me to meet other people.
How long was the boot camp that you went to?
It's one of your typical like 16-week boot camps. And it was like strictly front end, which is funny because my first job was a full stack developer writing C# and SQL. Yeah. Yeah, it was like your 16 weeks. I got hired like 3 months in. So I got hired well before it was over. By this time, I'd already been writing quite a bit of code using jQuery and making janky websites and things like that.
That's amazing, actually, that you got hired before the boot camp even finished. Why do you think you stood out? What did you do that made you get hired so quickly?
If I'm trying to think what made, I think I was more aggressive than a lot of other people in there. I think they're waiting for some like moment where they feel like, I know enough. And I thought, well, I know kind of enough, right? Like I understood that no matter how much I learn, there's certain things you just always have to learn on the job. Because even making the transition from like literally like running the streets to working in an office, that was a huge transition. I actually got called out a few times for basically like it's kind of embarrassing. Like not speaking English properly. Like I was so used to dealing with street people that when I
Hmm.
spoke sometimes at work, I remember the woman corrected me and said, you can't talk like that in here. You got to speak more properly and stuff. And that was embarrassing for me. But I also understood, and she told me this. She said, "You're really good at learning on the job," because she saw my transition even in there. And so I took the same approach to software. I thought, I'm going to learn enough, right? There's zero way I can be fully prepared for the job. So I was applying very early. Like I was applying, within the few weeks of being in the program. And this is one of the big motivations that they gave me. They say, "Hey, Brian, you're already ready to." Like the owners of the boot campers, like, you seem like you know what you're doing. Just start applying. And that led me to get lots of rejections. And I got used to rejection. I was also used to rejection as well, kind of doing my former life. You meet people, you try to sell something, you're haggling on prices. People say, "No, I don't want to buy that," or whatever. And you just get used to this game of selling. And so I'm like, well, here I am selling myself. I know I'm going to get rejected a lot. So I came with the right expectations. But I also knew that it would take a lot of volume to get that first job. And I was correct. And that's still holds true today, I think, for most people.
Yeah. I'm just blown away. I feel like it's so amazing because now you've obviously had a really amazing career, not only as a developer, but you've gone into management, you've gone back to being an IC engineer. And I just feel like literally from the streets, as in your own words, like from the streets, not doing very well, being very short-term oriented, and then doing a complete 180 and
Yeah.
landing a job before most of the people in your boot camp, I just think is so amazing. I think not only is it just a really inspirational story for me, but I think
Thank you.
that either just because of your unique background or just some natural inclination you have, you were able to discover things and now talk about them and share them that I think can be helpful to so many people. Like you mentioned two just now. One is don't wait until you're ready. You'll never be ready.
Yeah.
And then number two, be ready, be okay. Embrace rejection because that's part of the game. That's part of how
Yeah.
you grow. And I just feel like a lot of people, especially career switchers, don't have that mindset in the way that you had built up or you had learned throughout this whole journey.
Yeah, I talked to another person and he had a really good analogy. He said, learning to code is like the ticket to the dance. And that stuck with me hearing that. I'm like, yeah, it is. It's just, that's the step zero, right? Like
Yeah.
learning to code is just bare minimum. And being in the Bay Area, I had a huge advantage because I also was exposed to people like working in Lyft and realizing, okay, there's quite a lot of these people. At a certain point, it became very clear, like this is the epicenter of tech. Sounds funny now because like how could you not know that walking around the Bay Area? I was completely clueless at this point, but then I quickly became aware that this is the epicenter. So there's a lot of people here that know how to code, like more than like Kentucky, for example, or Indiana. And so I knew that competition would likely be more fierce and that I would just have to deal with lots of rejection. And I knew that, okay, coding is just step zero. And then, of course, when I got that first job, then I realized, like, oh, this is where the real game has begun.
Yeah.
Because I know less than I even thought I knew.
You're so generous with sharing your own story. And that's literally how we came to work together, right? You've been able to package up so much high quality wisdom into this guide on Taro, this course on Taro, break into tech and become a software engineer. And so I thought what might be interesting is just to hone in on a couple of the points, and I'll leave a link for people if they're interested in watching the whole thing. One of the things that stuck out to me was you have a section called the art of time management. Right? You have a long-term partner. You had a kid. You had this other
two of
career.
them.
You were transitioning. Two of them. Do you have two kids? So I think, especially for career switchers, more so than people who just went to school for computer science, time management is really difficult. So I'm wondering if you could just share what worked for you and what would you advise others who are trying to make that career switch?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate that. And time management is tough, right? Even now, like I have 3 kids now. I commute to work some days. Everybody has these competing interests and things pulling on their time, but especially when you're trying to learn to code if you have a job. And what worked for me and what I'd suggest for most people, or at least what worked for me, I don't know if I'd suggest it for most or whatever, everybody's different, but mornings were always my secret unlock to getting things done. So I knew that waking up 30 minutes earlier would give me just enough time if I knew what I was going to do. That was the other big piece to this puzzle. Getting up 30 minutes early was useless if I didn't already know what I was going to do. Because I could spend time bumbling on my computer and being like, wait, what was that thing I was going to do? I was going to make this button green, or I was going to learn this Code Academy thing on JavaScript. And then I just spin in circles. So I wanted to really focus and hone in on what was the most important thing for each day. So every day I would write down what I'm going to do the next day. And somebody in that boot camp I was at, they said this thing to me, which stuck in my head forever. I have no clue why. They said, I can tell when somebody's smart. They have a notebook. I'm like, And I'm like, well, I don't have a notebook. I
Yeah.
should get one. And so I get this notebook and I just started using it to do just this, to like write down and look important, right? And eventually I'm like, oh, this is really useful actually. I would like write down, here's what I'm going to do tomorrow morning. I'm going to do this. And I would get in on my computer and it would be open and I'd be like, boom. And so that 30 minutes in the morning, I'd get really far on these little side projects I was doing. So I'd make these janky side projects on Codecademy or on my computer or whatever, CodePen. And then I'd be able to know exactly what to do. And then I also knew that I had to have to sacrifice something. And that something for me was Netflix. I'd already sacrificed alcohol. And I saw at that point when I did that how much time opened up. I'm like, oh my God, what do I do with all this time? Like, I don't drink anymore. What do I do on my Saturdays? And I'm like, geez, I can't believe I have all this time, which was kind of intimidating. But then when I filled it in with coding, I'm like, oh, cool. Now that fills in this big gap. And then I thought, now I need even more time. Now I have a job now and I'm coding for work, but I also need to keep up. I don't know C# or SQL or all these other technologies that I have to know now for my living. And now I have to figure out how am I going to do that. And I'm like, okay, Netflix was a thing I got to cut out. So I just started sacrificing. What can I sacrifice? I was never into sports. I don't like watching sports, but I saw like some of my friends would spend 6 hours on a Sunday watching football. I'm like, that's crazy. Like and they're like, I'm so busy. I'm like, well, just cut out football.
Right.
You have a lot of time. Yeah.
I like it. I'm curious if, as you were doing this, did you guys have amazing willpower or were you working with other people? I find that if you give me 6 hours and you say, go learn, SQL, go learn C#, I'll probably get bored or I'll find it too difficult after an hour and I'll end up on YouTube or, Instagram or whatever. It sounds like, how did you have that problem or did you like have an accountability buddy or were you just able to kind of power through?
Yeah, I didn't really have an accountability buddy, even though I really believe in those tools and like processes to use. But for me, I just never worked for like more than a few hours at a time, honestly. Even now, like if I'm being honest, I have a business and I have a job and kids and all these things, right? I use my weekends to do work and to have fun, but I rarely will spend like more than 2-3 hours in a chunk of time doing anything because I just realize I can't keep that kind of motivation for that long. So that's the reason why during those weekdays, I'm like, okay, half an hour in the morning, that's enough for like really focused time, maybe an hour. But spending 6 full hours doing, I don't have that kind of willpower, and I can't sustain that kind of attention either, So that's just not the way I like to work. I kind of like to work in like sprints of time, buckets of time, and just power through some things, take a break, relax, go work out, then come back refreshed and then do it. And I feel like I've actually been more efficient doing that than like just trying to hammer through things in these massive chunks of time.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I operate too. I think 6 hours is kind of like, it's hard to decompose a problem down into 6-hour chunks. I can probably do it. Here's the thing that I think will take me half an hour, 45 minutes. I can now have the motivation to accomplish that. But, I think 6 hours is hard for anyone to really just sit down and really intellectually focus on the problem or learning for that long.
For sure.
Okay, one other thing that I think you're really well equipped to talk about and you've done such an amazing job with is networking. And you've actually you talked about in the course how you have spoken to more than 500 developers in very quick 15-minute coffee chats. And I think when you talk to engineers or career switchers in particular, you say the word networking, I do think oftentimes their eyes kind of gloss over. What does that mean? I keep hearing that. Like, how do I put it into action? But you've actually done a really good job of it. So I'm wondering if you could talk about what would you recommend to someone who, is about to go to a boot camp or just graduated from a boot camp? What should they do to actually benefit from networking?
Yeah. And I if I'm being honest, I looked at networking even a few years ago. I was like, well, that's not something I do. That's something like, what does that mean? Like giving my card to somebody, in a conference or something? Right. I didn't get it. I just didn't get it. But it's funny. That's how we met. And I've met so many amazing people online through just genuine networking. And I don't even like the term that much. I mean, I get it's a thing that we all understand, but think about it mostly as just showing curiosity and making friends online. So I've seen your content. It really resonated with me. I'm like, man, Rahul's building something really cool. Him and Alex have this amazing program. And at the time, I'm like, oh, this is exactly what software engineers need, right? I'm like, there's so much stuff for the early career people. What about the rest of us? Like, I became a manager and I'm like, I want to know what I should be doing. What do other people think? And when I saw that you were addressing some of these problems and talking to more people in their mid senior levels, I was like, oh, this is great. And then, I commented on your posts. I believe you did the same for me. I shouted you out. Just people I genuinely found interesting, I wanted to know more about. And so it didn't always start with like a DM like, hey, Rahul, would you want to give me a job at Taro or something? It was more
Right.
just commenting on your post saying, oh, that's really cool. Or, oh, I've done something similar, and adding to the conversation, just like you would in a party situation. Like you might go into a party if somebody's speaking about something that you actually find interesting or have some knowledge about, you share about it. And that's been super helpful. I've met so many like actual people that I like and made genuine connections with people on and offline now through just doing that. And there's even a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And if there's nothing else from that book that you take away, it's just ask people about themselves. We all love to talk about ourselves. And if you go up to somebody, you ask them genuinely, like, so what are you doing? What do you do for a living? Oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more. These can lead to one, interesting conversations. You can learn about the person. Also, it paints you in a very good light. So I kind of use this online. If I was in a boot camp, for sure I'd be doing this, because what you lack is validation if you're graduating from a boot camp. If you graduate from Stanford, Harvard, MIT, UC Berkeley, any four-year institution, you kind of have that built-in credibility. People say, okay, great, you've been validated. If you don't, you're going to need to find a way to create that credibility. And one way is to just make friends online with people that are in positions that you want to be in or work for, or near companies that you want to be part of or employed by.
I mean, the word you used was genuine, which I think is such a
Mm-hmm.
good way to describe how you operate. It's not like some AI generated spam comment. It's okay, this is someone, a real person, Brian, is
Yeah.
commenting on this post. It made me really interested in you. And you also never, it's not like, oh, can I get a job at Taro? Or
Yeah,
can you
right.
help me out? It's always, hey, here's something I'd like to learn more about you. Or hey, here's something that could help. And I think when you operate in that way, where it's all about giving and just trying to learn rather than trying to immediately figure out what is in it for you, I do think that you can build really strong connections, which will come back to help you in your job search or in your career later on.
Oh yeah, 100%. There was a young woman I spoke to during one of these 500 or 600 now calls I did. This is like 2 years ago almost now. And she found me on TikTok randomly. And I was like, oh, that's so funny you found me on TikTok. At the time I was like, had, like very few followers, and I kind of abandoned it since then. Anyway, we talked, and then she reached out to me on LinkedIn and says, here's a TikTok course I found that I think you might, get a kick out of. And I thought, what a really sweet, genuine thing to do. And out of all those 600 conversations, she's one of the people that sticks out in my head. I've talked to her since then. I believe she's now a software engineer, but she's the kind of person that I was like, oh, what a cool thing to do. And she did, or if she ever did want to ask for a referral or something, I'd gladly give it to her. I'm like, oh yeah, of course. I remember you. You were that person who gave me that TikTok Reels course 2 years ago.
I imagine she already had thought of it and she has made a connection of, hey, Brian might benefit. Let me
Yeah.
put two and two together. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to spend 10 hours of my life doing this big
Yeah.
favor for you, right? So that's
Send me
kind
a
of
link.
an amazing story.
Yeah.
One more area, which I thought, as I went through your course, that I thought was really interesting and a bit provocative, is this topic of, should you work for free? Right? It's kind of a chicken and egg problem where people don't want to hire you because you don't have experience, but because no one's willing to hire you, you never get experience, right? And so you had this really interesting take about working for free and when it might even make sense to do that. So could you expand on your advice on that for bootcamp grads or career switchers?
Yeah. I think career switchers especially need to, again, back to this idea of credibility. How can you get validated? You want somebody to pay you for something that you haven't really proven that you can do. If you have a job history, you've gone to school, you've kind of proven in quotes that you can do this thing. If you haven't, it's going to be really difficult to get somebody to immediately give you that trust. So in order to build it up and to get somebody to basically give you that validation, you trade work for validation. So I don't even see it as like necessarily free work. I see it like, I'm going to do something for you within reason, right? Like I did this. I've done this multiple times. When I wanted to become a software engineer, web developer, I reached out to a buddy. And that freelance experience I was telling you about it was free. Emphasis on the free part of that freelance. He said, hey, I got some sites I'm building for like an architect. Would you like to upgrade it to use Bootstrap, like 3 or something at the time, or Bootstrap 2 or whatever? I said, yeah, sure. I did it. I didn't get paid, and I gladly did it. And I said, great. Can I use you as a reference? He said, yeah, sure. Can I put that I work for your company? Because I technically do. He said, yeah. And I said, cool. Keep giving me some of these free projects. I'll keep doing them if it's okay if I use you as a reference, and I can maybe you can add me as a contractor to your company. And he says, yeah, sure. And that was really helpful, because then when I went to the job interviews, like, okay, what's the first thing they read on my resume? It's not admin assistant, or honestly, I had no work history for like 8 years. So I had to put something on there, and that was the best thing to put. So if you're like a car mechanic, for example, if you're manager and reading that, you're like, okay, car mechanic. You're thinking, is this person here for the right job? And it's really
Yeah.
difficult to understand what they're there for. So if you do some freelancing and use that in exchange for like, hey, give me a recommendation, maybe that badge on my LinkedIn that tells you I worked for this company, it's huge, right? And this didn't just stop when I was really junior. I wanted to work in sales for a buddy's company. This is about 5 years ago or so. And I said, hey, man, I want to learn sales. I've know enough coding now. I feel pretty confident that I want to learn how to do sales. So it's cool. And he has a company, and he's like, I want you to do 100 sales calls, like 6 a.m. on the East Coast. And I did them all for free. And he had no intention of paying me. I understood he wouldn't pay me because I don't know anything about sales at the time. And so I did. I did 100 calls. I went through like this phone book of like hairdressers on the East Coast at 6 a.m. before work. And I did that for 2 weeks. And that taught me a lot about cold calling. I'd wanted the experience.
Yeah, I think the nuance that you're calling out, which I think is so smart, is that compensation doesn't just mean money. It could also mean validation. It could also mean expanding your network. It could mean learning the trade of sales or engineering or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And I think people are often way too reductive when it comes to, oh, I need a certain amount of income. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I'm being taken advantage of, or I'm not even going to consider it. And so this is a really good perspective, especially for people who are really trying to break into the industry. You frankly don't have the leverage to say, I want to get at least 100K, otherwise I'm not even going to
Yeah,
consider it. That might not be the best option for you.
absolutely. And then you think long term too. I think a lot of people think this really short term thinking of like, I want it now. I want this, my first job to be this. I'm like, this is a career that's going to span decades, right? So
Yeah.
you're going to be doing this for quite a long time. You might as well start off with a solid foundation and get your foot in the door by any means necessary instead of just going for like what's the fastest way to get to this goal that is probably unattainable. Like that's, and counterintuitively it's going to take you longer to reach that goal if you're trying to jump over these critical steps almost.
Brian, it's so clear to me why you have succeeded just from hearing you talk about your
Thank
journey
you.
and how you're able to articulate it. And I'm really, really happy that you've packaged it up into the course on Taro, breaking the tech and become a software engineer. And people might not realize this. You took it one step further. You are the owner now of your own bootcamp, Parsity.
That's right.
So can you talk about why did you make that move to, now you're on the other side of it. You're not a student in the boot camp, you're the one running the boot camp. And so I feel
Yeah.
like just the fact that you've gone through that will make your boot camp so much better. But I'm really curious about why you made that move.
Yeah, it was a connection I made through LinkedIn. I met the previous owner and I really liked what he was doing. He had me as a speaker there and then as a curriculum writer. And I was like, this is good stuff. He was doing all the right things, teaching back end programming principles as well as testing, things I don't see at a lot of other places. And with candidates I've met over the years, I thought, wow, what a really excellent program. And I was really happy to help upgrade the curriculum. And then at some point, he's like, hey, I want to pursue other endeavors. How would you like to take this over? I'm like, whoa, okay. And so I did. And it's been the most difficult and rewarding thing I've done because it's so cool to see that life change. Because I'm like, learning to code is one thing. And I get that that's kind of what I'm quote unquote selling, like learn to code. But what it really is, it's a transformational life change. So when I meet people and I speak to students that have gone from one guy was a professor of music or one guy was an EMT, and they go from maybe either struggling financially or not being able to pursue, other interests, have time with their family, things I kind of take for granted after all these years of doing it. And you see that life change. That's a pretty amazing thing to be able to offer people. So it's been really rewarding doing it. But yeah, it's difficult too. It's running a business as well. But I really hope that having that personal touch in there and doing all the things that I know work for people is the big differentiator.
Yeah. And I think the one area where you are very spiky is like founder market fit, or maybe we can call like owner market fit. And that out of everyone in the world, you are probably the most qualified person to run this company and make that transformation happen compared to, some Harvard MBA suit wearing, private equity backed player. Like I feel like it's so much more real with you. And I think people can benefit from it in a much more genuine way coming from you.
I appreciate that. I hope so. That's always the intention. That's also one of the reasons why we're really small, because I can't really scale myself. So we're never going to be some big boot camp ever.
Yeah. How many students like typically in a given year go through Parsity?
Less than 100. So I think we'll make the cap, like a max cap will probably be 100, but anywhere between 60 and 80 students per year.
And is there a location restriction there? Like you have to be in California or on the West Coast, or is it
No,
kind of
not at all.
anywhere?
It could be anywhere you want. It was a brick and mortar place at one point. Now it's gone fully online. And we see that nearly all of the people that come into Parsity are career changers. People typically
Yeah.
have kids, family, career. So yeah, it helps us expand and reach more people.
I will leave a link for Parsity if anyone watching wants to be one of those 100 people for the upcoming batches. I'll leave a link to your course on Taro, Brian, and of course LinkedIn is I think where you put out a lot of good content, a lot of good advice. Is there anything else you want to shout out or any other links you want me to include?
No, I think that's all the right places to find me. If you want to find me on Instagram as well, actually, every once in a while I do post there. Brian Ginny Code.
All right, we'll do some IG content up as well. Brian, I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing all this, and I'm super excited once again for all the people to benefit from, your life experience and also years of the struggle that you went through to transition into engineering.